Don't you folks have anything better to do on a Wednesday night? Cedric back there, he comes to every presentation I make. He's like a groupie. He is. You're all doing well? Everyone's doing well? Many of you I recognize because a week ago or so you participated in a little tour that we gave of St. Stanislaus and St. John's Church over on the east side. Did you enjoy that? Did you enjoy that time? I was telling Dr. Riley earlier that I felt bad that the one thing I didn't do was to sort of say farewell to all of you. You got so preoccupied with St. Stan's and you were looking at Jesus's body in the altar that we never really had a chance to say goodbye. But my voice is a little off today. You can probably hear that. I was a little flustered earlier this evening because I expected to get here really early to set things up. I'm kind of a stickler for detail. But I got caught there on Green Garden, 14th and Green Garden, behind two trains, not one, but two. But a couple of weeks ago, we had a little session in Warner Books, and I'm thankful for Christine Gerlach, whom you might know from the Jefferson. She's always very helpful in setting up these kinds of presentations. I see that some of you have actually purchased the book, and I'll expect a book report later on today. But what I've discovered already, and the whole evening is devoted to explaining where the book came from. I'll read a little bit of its contents, but what I've discovered is that folks are reading those short essays, which are only a couple of pages long, right? Kind of as a devotional routine. They'll get up in the morning and read a couple of words that I have written, and that certainly tickles me. I think I've said many times here at the Jefferson that I believe that all good teaching, maybe even bad teaching, is inherently autobiographical, right? If I were to ask you to close your eyes and think of the best coach you ever had, the best mentor you ever had, the best teacher you ever had, I bet it was more than just the syllabus they handed out or the class structure that they offered you. It was about their souls. It was about the way they see the world that you valued the most, because those of us who are teachers, and many of you are, you know that the reason we teach is we want to hand on what we believe in or what we love. The word traditio, means to hand on, to give to another generation. I love teaching, as you can tell. I like to use my hands as well. But I like teaching because it's such an inherently intimate kind of a routine or habit. Autobiography, I think, is useful. If I lapse into hagiography, which, as some of you know, means determining whether somebody is a saint or not, or talking about them as a saint, you sort of give me the thumbs down or that kind of a gesture, right? What I do have to explain, though, and I did share this with some of you who were part of that group of 51 people who decided to look at St. John's and St. Stan's last week, I think I explained to you that it's kind of hard with a name like Michael DeSanctis, not to be involved in religion or religious studies or teaching at a place like Gannon. Some of you might know that Hebrew name Mikael is actually a question. The L tag means God, right? Who is like God? My daughter Rachel has the same kind of a tag. Rachael, she's like the sacrificial goat, the sacrificial ram. Uriel, Mikael, and so forth. But my surname as well is something that I've been saddled with ever since I came out of my mother's womb, the name DeSanctis. It gets mispronounced all the time in Erie. People, have seen the name DeSantis before, and they pronounce it that way, or they misspell it that way. It really has a long history to it. My name, as you can see there, printed in nice, bold red letters, appears in what's called the Missale Romanum, the Roman Missal. And I think last week when I was with all of you, I mentioned that the word missa is the Latin form of our word for Mass. We get the word dismissal from that. When Catholics go to Mass, It's because they're coming together in kind of an incubator of grace. They're being transformed, and they're being sent back out to the world to help redeem the world, as Christ does. They participate in that sacrificial activity. It is kind of neat to have my name showing up in that big, fat, thick red book that you see Father bring up to the altar for those of you who are Roman Catholics or Lutheran or Episcopalian. It's kind of like the guidebook that priests have to follow to keep the Mass unified from one place to another. I mean, you've all been to McDonald's, right? You already know what a Big Mac tastes like in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's the same Big Mac you're going to have in Corey or Union City, right? Because the folks at McDonald's follow the script. Some of you also know that for the past 40 years, while I was teaching at Gannon, I got into the business of helping people build and renovate places of worship. You'll understand that a little bit more in a second, because I want to introduce you to my grandfather. His name was Ernesto, or Ernest DeSanctis. He came from the little hill towns that ring Salerno in the southern part of Italy, and he already had a craft, a technique before he came to the States in 1906. He lived to be 100, and he and I were very close to each other. He was a church painter, a church decorator. So it's really kind of in my genes. You see that photograph over there on the left-hand side? He would have been about 70 years old when he was sitting on those scaffolds. And the thing that amazes me is that my grandfather would have to build the darn scaffold first and then sit on it. What he's probably doing is painting what's called calcimine on the ribs there of a Gothic building, maybe 40 feet up, 50 feet up. I don't even know where he got the courage to do that. See the white hair he's got? We used to ask him, "No, how come you've got capelli bianchi?" He said, "Well, the white to lead, the white to lead, she falls in my hair, and I can't get around that." But my grandfather was a very pious person. He wasn't pietistic. He would never impose his faith on you. He would never trivialize his faith, but he was a devout person. He even thought he might want to be a priest when he was a young guy. Now, when I was a young man, and I did share this with some of you sitting in the pews the other day, growing up in Utica, New York, right smack in the middle of the state. Utica was roughly the size of Erie when I was growing up there in the 50s and 60s. I lived in the upper flat of a 1920s style, duplex style building, and my grandfather had his studio along with rooms where he lived with my grandmother. The studio was on the first floor, certainly at the time of retirement when I got to know him. I think he was about 70 years old when I was born. And then down in the basement, he also had something of a studio. You can understand, excuse me, why that might have been a problem the time that the Niagara Mohawk meter reader came to visit the house. He went down into the kind of the dark belly of the house, and what he discovered is that covered up by a drop cloth were the legs of a man who seemed to be Palestinian, kind of a Middle Eastern complected man, impaled by a nail. His legs were nailed on a cross. Well, of course, the meter reader did what any good meter reader would do. He called the police, who came to that house where my grandfather lived and tried to charge my grandfather with murdering this poor fellow. As you all know, that's actually the corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S, that you find on a Catholic crucifix, and one of many corpuses that my grandfather would have repaired over the years. This photograph was probably taken when my grandfather was in his late 60s or early 70s. Really strong man and strong-willed. And what I love about this photograph is that tucked in his side pocket, he used to take his old suits and he would make them into work clothes. And he would always go off to work in a suit and then change into his overalls. You see how he's got his rag there? And, he was full of the kind of axioms and little bits of wisdom that I think we all look to our grandparents to give to us. He used to say, for example, keep your rag clean and your hands cleaner. Which really was his way of saying, keep your body clean and keep your soul cleaner, And one of the other rules he had is never put your wooden ladders on the grass because they might be affected by the dampness. Always put them on horses. In the 1950s, he was really slow to begin using rollers. He thought rollers were a way of cheating if you were a painter. Interestingly enough, and I'll dare to tell you this story, he was working in a church one time with his crew, and he had to stain the wainscoting that he found at the bottom of the wall within the sanctuary space, the nave space. But he ran out of stain, okay? Now, that didn't stop my grandfather, because over there in Italy, he had learned the chemistry for making stains. He said to the guys, come down from your ladders, put your brushes down, go into the restroom, and I'll give you this coffee tin, okay? Why don't you fill the coffee can with uric acid? I won't ask you where you get the uric acid. So they all urinated into the tin, and my grandfather, using his chemical wisdom, he never went to grad school, but he knew enough about chemistry that he was able to finish the job by using this concoction. I'll tell you another story that at first I wasn't going to. Well, I guess I really told you some interesting stories. You might say, well, Michael, those stories are a little bit off color. But you see, my grandfather was able to not only work on statues that conveyed to me the importance of the incarnation, but when he would do frescoes, for example, he made it clear to me that you have to take the incarnation seriously, which is something I mentioned last Monday morning. You guys didn't realize I was going to give you so much theology. Especially in Catholicism, we take the incarnation very seriously. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, became a member of the human race. And he wasn't sort of play acting. Jesus, Yeshua, the second person of the Trinity, took on human flesh. And he was exactly like us in all ways except for sin, right? Scripture says that. Some denominations of Christianity don't want to deal with the problem of the incarnation. There are lots of problems that have to do with the incarnation. How strong are you in your faith to deal with the fact that Jesus truly became a member of the human race? And how do you reconcile that concept with your belief that God is transcendent? God became transcendent and immanent at the same time. In fact, you tell me, do you think Jesus of Nazareth ever sweated? Did he ever sweat? Those of you who are physicians, right? We got two of them right over here. Did he ever respire? Did he ever perspire? That means little beads of water came to the top of his skin and evaporated. That means divine water, divine material is somehow part of this sort of aqueous environment, the water system that you and I live in. Some of Jesus's perspiration is actually in Lake Erie. It's in a little glass of water. We don't want to deal with the implication of that, or what theologians like to call the scandal of particularity. Jesus wasn't just an abstract figure. He was a particular figure. He had eyebrows, and he had a skin color, and he had nasal hair, and he had human sexuality. He had a pelvis. We'd rather not deal with all those things. We'd rather just sort of embrace the Christ that you see here in my grandparents' nativity scene and call it a day. We tend to want to shove Jesus back up into heaven because it's just too scary to think that he's in Erie, Pennsylvania, and that somehow through baptism he's embodied in all of us. Again, those of you who might have thought that my photographs and my story were a little off color, again, my grandfather lived to be a century old, 100 years old, which is not such a big deal nowadays. But in 1985, when he died at 100 years old, that was a big deal. And every day, even at 100, he would watch Mass on television, believing that somehow this Eucharistic affair, this Eucharistic sacramental encounter with Christ was nourishing to him. Remarkable man. Those of you who already have copies of the book, and I'll be signing some or selling some out there later on, you might know that I've got a couple of chapters that I dedicated to my grandfather. One of them has to do with the lessons that he gave to me on Saturday mornings when I got into high school. Because my town had so many Italian Americans, the school district actually allowed for Italian to be taught in all the public high schools. So I took 4 years of Italian, and I would go to my grandfather's house, stay there over the weekend. My grandmother was there as well, and my grandfather would teach me all about the arts that are part of Eucharistic celebration, but also teach me a little bit about Italian. My grandfather loved the NASA program. He loved the moon shots that were televised and so important in the 1960s. He could never quite figure out how you and I are sort of on this revolving ball, and we shoot these rockets toward a revolving orb like the moon, and we're able to hit it. And in his mind, those Saturn V rockets that we developed were just like Gothic architecture. They were pointing to the heavenly Jerusalem. And I have an article in the book that actually includes the illustration that you see there, where he sort of celebrated the first moon landing, the 3 astronauts, Collins and Aldrin and Neil. Who was the other one? Mo, Larry, and Curly. He celebrated it with this beautiful sort of French curve that sort of dealt with the trajectory of that mission. Now, to sort of make things simpler, let's jump all the way to my arrival in Erie back in 1985. I've been here for 40 years now. Came to a place called Gannon University, which I had never really heard about. A place called Erie, Pennsylvania, which I heard about a little bit. Because when my parents were living in Albany, New York, I would take the Lakeshore Limited from Albany to Cleveland, jump off of the train, jump on a Greyhound bus, and go down to Athens, Ohio. Well, I had written a doctoral dissertation in Athens in the time that I was there on the effect of changes in liturgy in the past 70 years within the Catholic fold, the effect that had on architecture and music. I sort of studied both of those things at the same time. So when I came to Gannon, I was teaching architecture, theology, and so forth. And as a regular part of my work, I would bring these kids through church buildings, which in the 40 years that I was at Gannon became increasingly important because, as you know, very few kids are churched nowadays. We live in an unchurched culture. For goodness sake, the kids don't even know the contours of the Christ story. I had one young lady, this girl, Laura Wagner, who's now married and has kids of her own. She gave me this book that you see there, He Was One of Us, which deals with the incarnation. And in the frontis of the book, she wrote a nice little note. She said, Dr. DeSanctis, you always tell us that your 2 favorite subjects are art and God. And I think that's probably still the case if you were to ask my wife. I learned early on as a child by way of my grandfather that you can't separate aesthetic experience from spiritual experience, which is certainly a part of the Catholic way of looking at Christianity, that beauty is the physical manifestation of truth, and truth is the physical manifestation of holiness, right? You know, the Greeks always found holiness and beauty. Jews 40 centuries ago found beauty and holiness. There's kind of a connection between those two things. As I mentioned to the group the other day, when you hold your first little baby in your arms and that baby can't be anything other than what she already is, right? It's so inherently true that she's beautiful. You don't even know her very well. She's been in your womb for 9 months. She pops out and instantly you realize she's sacred because she's so heartbreakingly beautiful. This is something I've always been intrigued by, which is exactly why I gave the tour last week of a place like St. Stanislaus. Imagine Erieites putting up a building like this today, right? We are fairly wealthy as a culture today, but we're kind of stingy with our pennies. Our sacrificial giving habits are different. But these working class folks came from Poland to Erie. They created what they call Polonia, which means Little Poland. They dedicated this beautiful church to a bishop named Stanislaus. That was the habit among Poles. And even today, in its renovated form, and those of you who were in that building can attest to that, it sure is a heck of a nice looking building. It's a chunk of heaven come down to Erie, Pennsylvania. It makes heaven particular and imminent to all of us. And some of you can probably find yourself in this photograph. I mean, maybe scratching your head or combing your hair or something like that. But you remember how spectacular that space was. I love this beautiful baldacchino. The word baldacchino comes from the word Baghdad, right? Because there's lots of Bagdads, lots of tents in Baghdad. I love this because, and you can sort of make this out, it's got the word sanctus, sanctus, sanctus on it, you know? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Adonai. God is three veils removed from us. He's so holy. And again, you can probably see yourself in this photograph. Here's St. John the Baptist Church, built by primarily German immigrants over there. What is that, 26th and Wallace? You know, and these folks would live in small houses. They carried small mortgages, but they tossed their pennies into a collection plate every Sunday, and they were able to create a house for God, a house for God's people. Pretty remarkable. Some of you might know that when I was at Gannon, I got into the habit of filling the bookstore windows with these nativity scenes, partly, again, to teach my students a little bit more about the incarnation. Even kids at a Catholic school today aren't necessarily familiar with the gospel story of Jesus' birth. They've been thoroughly secularized. In my time since leaving Gannon back in 2019, I certainly have failed retirement. I wasn't really intending on being retired. I've made this sort of a mission or a ministry of mine. Some of you may have been able to go down to Covenant Church to see these pieces from year to year. They're always original from year to year, and I have to engineer them so I can get them out of my attic studio, bring them downtown, and then show them to the folks who love to see them. They've become part of a tradition, I guess, in Erie, Pennsylvania that really tickles me. It moves me a great deal that folks are moved by these nativity scenes to the point where they not only want to visit the exhibits at Covenant Church. I'm not a member of Church of the Covenant, but the folks there are kind enough to let me store the things in one of their classrooms. And the other thing I involve myself in to kind of give back to, Erie's culture, is all the work that I've been doing for the Jeffersons since we started about 20 years ago. Some of you may have been present. Cedric probably came to this presentation 1,000,000 years ago on Michelangelo and the greatness of his artistic genius. As recently as just a couple of days ago, again, because I failed retirement, and again, forgive me for all this autobiographical stuff, but I've become now the senior editor of a magazine called Emmanuel. It's actually published by a congregation of priests whose charism or mission is to promote Eucharistic prayer. Emmanuel has been printed for over 125 years, but the current market for periodical literature being what it is, it kind of went belly up a couple of years ago. Well, I've been tapped now to take this idea and turn it into a virtual magazine that will be online, and pretty exciting. I wrote the cover article that you see here just a couple of years ago, based it on a Pietà image from Germany that you'll find at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And isn't it interesting that we go into museums today and Christian art is as unfamiliar to us as Egyptian art or Assyrian art or Greek or Roman art. Some of you have heard my story before about how my wife Kelly and I went to the Cleveland Museum of Art a couple of years ago. We were in the medieval gallery, and a little boy came up to his mother and said, "Mommy, how come everybody has circles on their heads?" And you would think, well, maybe she'd make up the word halo, or she'd, rely on that kind of a word. She couldn't even grasp that word. She said, "I don't know, ask your dad." And the dad said, "Let's go into the Renaissance gallery," right? And then that's one of the hidden costs of us becoming a much more secular culture. Imagine in my class trying to teach something like Michelangelo's David with a group of kids who don't know the backstory of David and Goliath. They've never heard that story before. So I have to teach them religion in order to teach them works of art. Now, the book that some of you have in front of you, as you already know, came out of this column that I began writing for the Senior News once a month. And I'm not sure where you pick your copy up from, but I always pick mine up from a supermarket, from Giant Eagle. It was about 3 years ago that I tossed out to the editors the idea of a column on senior spirituality, partly because of the affection that I have for folks older than myself, that I bet comes from my connection with my grandparents. And as I was saying to some of the folks earlier, I get up with my wife early in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. I sort of prime the pump by writing feverishly until about 7:30. I go off to morning mass that lasts from 8 o'clock to 8:30, and then I try to write until noontime for this project. And it was out of that collection of essays that from the beginning, I knew I was going to create some kind of a book, which I'm calling Supermarket Sermons. And there's our Giant Eagle, or one of them at least. I won't ask you folks where you shop. I don't know why Wegmans doesn't carry the little newspaper. And I love the fact that the newspaper in some ways has to compete with all of the other media that bombard us when we walk into a supermarket, right? It's kind of interesting that when they poll Americans today, they find that they no longer learn about Christ from church or from sermons or from pastors. We learn about Christianity from Hollywood or from magazines that are right next to the magazine that deals with Elvis or Princess Di or UFOs taking over Elvis or Princess Di, you know, or the Titanic. I also like the fact that it's really kind of a low-tech publication, right? You can't even go online to find my articles. You have to pick up the paper itself, which is an object, a sacramental that you hold in your hand. And what I'm really fighting is the secular culture that, as you all know, has been kind of avoiding any kind of attachment to churches and mosques and synagogues and so forth. We are becoming an increasingly secular culture. So I guess I had my work cut out for me when I decided to write these articles. It's interesting, though, because we're at a moment in our history where science now is sort of being reconciled with religion. At Gannon University, we've always taught our students that logic and faith are related to each other. There's no discrepancy there. I mean, God is the author of our brains, our minds, but if you look at those incredible photographs that are coming to us from the Hubble telescope or the James telescope, you can understand why even scientists today are beginning to acknowledge that there seems to be an order in the universe. But where did it come from? You know, recently I've been reading Ross Douthat's book called Believe. He's an opinion editor, opinion writer in the New York Times, who recently converted to Catholicism, but it could have been any ism. And he makes a really interesting point. He says, not only has the world been made, was the world made, but because of its fine tuning, it seems to reveal that it was made for us. It's just so finely tuned. It couldn't have been happenstance. You know, that's the classic question that people always have. Did the universe come into being all by itself, or was there some divine mind behind the whole thing? The three questions I put to myself when I began writing the series of articles were these. Given the skepticism or the secularism of our culture today, does religion even have a place in the public square any longer? I don't know what you folks find, but I find that when folks want to talk about religion, they get really soft. Because it's kind of embarrassing. I mean, every one of us in this room, when we were in first grade, second grade, we learned the empirical method. We learned how science works. And science only puts faith in those things that are tangible, empirical, that can be tested. Well, how do you go on believing in a God you've never seen, who becomes a member of the human race by means of a virgin, who's never had sex with a man, who dies and then somehow miraculously wriggles out of his grave 3 days later and then flies up into space again to the heavenly Jerusalem? How do you folks reconcile science with religion? Can they be reconciled? I actually know the answer to that because I know some of you, and I kind of have gotten a sense of how you reconcile those two things in your own life. Here's another question I ask myself. You know, is it really legitimate to offer sermons or sermonizing on beauty and grace and wisdom in a place like a supermarket. Can a supermarket be holy? Which is kind of interesting because recently a lot of Christian archaeologists are finding that the first generations of the followers of Jesus didn't just come together in their homes. They didn't just have house churches. They came together in warehouses. They came together in public spaces. They were always searching for places that were large enough to accommodate their numbers. And in Christianity, bread and wine aren't the only two things that are consecrated. Christians are baptized. They become members of the body of Christ. Their buildings become consecrated to a special function. Here's another interesting question. Do you think Erie's seniors possess insights on the nature of God, faith, life, and death that other age groups don't? In fact, maybe I'll put that question to you, right? Because there's nobody in this room tonight under 40. Do you think the kids you know, your grandparents, your children, do you think they're as sensitive to these questions as your generation, our generation? Anybody want to be bold enough to? If not, I'll pick on somebody. I mean, think of it this way. Do we who are, I'll be 68 in a couple of days, okay? Those of us who are in our 60s, 70s, 80s, do you think we have an advantage over young people because of our closeness to death, because of the great, tremendous library of experiences that we've had that make us able to talk about these things in ways that children can't? Or young people can. Anybody want it? Yes, Doctor? Dr. Levy?
I think if you're old enough and you're lucky enough to not have to worry about paying a mortgage, that leaves you time to think of all kinds of other things that the young just, won't tolerate.
Oh, okay.
Is he earning a living?
Okay.
And so, it gives you an advantage in a lot of things.
Yeah. So time to ponder these things is important. When you're busy making a living and raising kids, diapering children, you can't think about the nature of the Trinity, right? Okay. There was another hand somewhere. Yes?
Ditto. and I'm a cradle Catholic, and I became aware as I got older and I didn't have to pay the mortgage and I didn't have to raise the kids anymore. I thought, your spirituality is the same as it was when you were 16. How can that be? You're in church every week. You follow all the rules like a nice Catholic. And that's when my journey began. And also, I think it's connected to the fact that the end is near. So you think, okay, what do I do with this life? When it's over, what have I done to make a difference?
Right.
And I think as you get older, I think that question.
Yeah, and even beyond that question of service, there is the ultimate question: is there something beyond the grave or not? And of course, one of the great advantages of religion is that it does give us hope that yes, we do exist beyond the grave. Mrs. Mitsoveris, did you want to say something?
I just want to take up for the younger generation because I have one in my life, and I think the generation that's coming up now that are in their 20s, they think about profound things.
Good. Okay.
Because they have to.
Sure.
But they think about profound things. They think about spirituality, and they're looking for authenticity in it.
Right. And they maybe don't necessarily buy into the strictures and structures that packaged that spirituality for us in the old days, right? Yes, Dr. Riley.
I agree with that. I often thought to myself growing up that we lived in a kind of an antiseptic world, a protected world, compared with our parents. I mean, the depression, the
Sure.
that. But I looked at a class shot of my mother in the late 20s, and she told me, well, this person died of a burst appendix. This one died of these things. And I'm thinking, okay, so here we are with kids that see nothing but violence, post-apocalyptic world, get used to it. But people back then, they kind of lived with it as part of life, as opposed to part of,
Sure.
And I think it was in the context of a culture that was melded to an understanding of life and death.
Right.
Why did this little girl died.
That's right.
Whereas now, I feel that kids today are just cut off from any sense of salvation, many kids, because of the media and
Sure.
the world, even the news that's portrayed.
Or they turn to something like sports as their basic sort of mythology and so redemption. I mean, rather than worshiping the saints, they worship ball players or rock stars. Or
If I could say one other thing that I've noticed,
Sure.
and that is that the way the media works today is that we are part of every disaster around the world.
right.
Whereas in the old days, you had your neighborhood. You could go to
Yeah,
stands
that's right.
and pray as to why the woman around the block was hit by a trolley car.
Right, right.
So, but you're part of everything, but not connected to it. And it's
Right.
very bizarre.
Sort of detached. As much as we talk about networking and being part of a virtual community. I really enjoyed writing these articles for an audience I'll never meet. And just a couple of weeks ago, Kelly and I were on a ship in the North Sea. We ran into the gentleman that you see there with the ball cap and the walking stick. He was probably in his late 80s. And John, this sort of goes to what you were talking about. Things really have changed a great deal. In the old days, when you got into your 80s, you sort of prepared for death, right? You thought of yourself as an old person. That doesn't hold back anyone any longer. People still like to learn and to know what it is to be part of this incredible mystery, this gift called human life. Now, to be very personal with you, I have to tell you that I have 4 children, one of them whom just got married this past weekend. Not in a church. He chose to be married in a natural environment, not with a priest, but an officiant, and he does his own thing. But when my kids were small, we had in our house on Cockwa Boulevard this great staircase. You know, here's all 4 of them, kind of crazy kids. And the first story I want to read to you briefly today, this evening, if you'll sort of tolerate that, is called The Last Leap. It appeared originally in Commonweal magazine, but I've decided to make it part of my book. And again, it was inspired by the experiences that I had with my children on that staircase, because it goes like this. Years ago, when my kids were hardly more than babies, we'd play a game together called Trust Daddy. The rules were simple. Climbing to the 4th or 5th step of our foyer staircase, they'd hurl themselves into the air, flying squirrels in PJs, certain they'd land safely in my arms where I'd smother them in kisses. Adding to the game's high drama, I'd sometimes place my arms behind my back before they'd jump, and dare them even more to fling themselves at me, fearless of the possibility I'd ever fumble in my role as kitty catcher and let them meet the hardwood floor beneath us. It's a miracle kids survive the bumps and bruises of childhood at all, let alone the threat of injury that accompanies the silly variations on roughhousing invented by their dads. Lately, however, I've wondered whether I wasn't inadvertently teaching my children something important about life, faith, and the divine fatherhood or parenthood of God, just by playing with them in a goofy sort of way. The province of fatherhood, I suppose, when their mom wasn't watching. What brings this to mind is the recent death of my own father, a retired banker who spent decades dodging the worst effects of diabetes, only to succumb in the end to some sneakier aspects of the disease. Shortly before his death, my dad called my siblings and me and our mom together for what turned out to be a combination board meeting and domestic ritual, during which he calmly laid out a roadmap for his final journey toward death. The setting was a tiny intensive care room at the very hospital where he'd been born 85 years earlier, where we'd all been born. In fact, a stone's throw from the church where his funeral would be held just days later. Presiding from his bed, as he always had, the head of the family table, my father imparted to us a mix of wisdom and faith as matter-of-factly as possible. He knew from the tumult unfolding in his body that death was just around the corner and wanted his loved ones to embrace that fact without illusion, like the numbers in a bank statement, real, fixed, non-negotiable. Sitting on his lap the whole time was a page from a diocesan newspaper bearing an essay by the syndicated author Ron Rolheiser. Some of you know Rolheiser. He's a Catholic priest from Canada originally. It was called Guidelines for the Long Haul, which my father read aloud like the contents of a solemn epistle. Be grateful, he implored us, quoting Rolheiser.